On Thanksgiving, our family was supposed to go on vacation. As we packed, my mother-in-law secretly slipped a handbag into my suitcase. I pretended not to notice. Just before we left for the airport, I swapped my suitcase with my sister-in-law's. When we reached the security checkpoint, my mother-in-law saw what was happening and broke down in tears. It was over. That Thanksgiving, I was 28 years old, and it was the first time I had ever seen my in-laws' house in such a state of controlled chaos. It wasn't the chaos of laughter, but the chaos of suitcase wheels groaning against the tile floors, the sound of a zipper being pulled shut, then snagging, the sound of my mother-in-law calling out names like a drill sergeant, and the steady, rhythmic ticking of the wall clock that made my chest feel tight. There are 4 people in my husband's family. My father-in-law, Richard. My mother-in-law, Carol. My husband, David, and his sister, Megan. I'm Clara, the daughter-in-law. After 3 years of marriage, I had grown accustomed to my mother-in-law's strict routines, even the way she could smile without it ever reaching her eyes. But I still believed that if people lived together long enough, they would eventually soften, that they would learn to truly care for one another. That was my naivety. It lasted until the night before our family trip. My husband had arranged it, saying we needed to get away to change our luck after a stressful year for his business. The destination was Miami, a flight away. The thought of the ocean, the breeze, the salty air, I craved it too. I was excited, but I didn't dare show it too much. I was afraid if I seemed too eager, I'd be called a frivolous daughter-in-law, so I packed my things quietly. Everything was neat, everything in its place. The living room that evening looked like a small warehouse, with 5 colorful suitcases lined up against the wall. My mother-in-law stood in the middle of the room, a notepad in her hand, her eyes darting from one suitcase to the next, her voice a monotone that no one dared interrupt. "Richard, your black suitcase goes by the door so it's easy to pull out. David, where are the documents? Check the IDs and boarding passes. Don't wait until we're there to start scrambling. Megan, stop packing like you're moving out. We're only gone for a few days." Megan, who was stuffing a 4th dress into her suitcase, pouted but didn't dare argue back. My husband walked back and forth between the bedroom and the living room, occasionally bending down to help me with a stubborn zipper, giving me a small, apologetic smile that said, "I'm sorry, you know how she is." I was crouched in a corner, double-checking my own things one last time. Headache medicine, motion sickness pills, sunscreen, a few light outfits, some snacks for the flight. I've always been thorough, wanting to be prepared for anything. I thought simply that this was a vacation, a chance for the family to grow closer. Maybe my mother-in-law would see me in a different light. That was until I saw her, Carol, walk down the hallway toward the master bedroom. She was holding something small, dark, and compact. It looked like a purse. She moved quickly, her footsteps light, as if she were afraid of being heard. I looked up just at that moment. The living room light caught her, and I saw the strap of the bag dangling from her hand before she disappeared behind the bedroom door. I didn't ask. I pretended to be busy rearranging my things as if I hadn't seen a thing. 3 years as a daughter-in-law had taught me one thing. In this house, there were some questions that only led to trouble. But my heart wasn't stupid. It began to beat faster than usual, a premonition of something wrong. About 10 minutes later, my mother-in-law came out with a plate of sliced apples and set it on the table. She looked at me, her voice a little softer than usual. "Clara, have some fruit. Are you tired from packing?" "No, I'm almost done, ma'am," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. As I lifted a slice of apple to my mouth, I glanced at my suitcase. It was a plain gray color. I always left the zipper pull on the left side, where it was easiest for me to grab. But now, it was slightly off-center, as if it had been opened and hastily closed again, and I knew I hadn't touched it since I'd packed it. I smiled and continued eating the apple, but inside, a knot was tightening in my stomach. It was nearly midnight before everyone was finally done. My mother-in-law repeated her instructions over and over, as if one wrong step would ruin the entire trip. "Tomorrow at the airport, everyone is responsible for their own documents. Remember which suitcase is yours. Don't get them mixed up and cause problems." My father-in-law nodded just to placate her. Megan mumbled yes while scrolling through her phone. And I looked at my gray suitcase, then back at my mother-in-law's eyes. She didn't look at me for long, but I caught a flicker of something. It wasn't hatred. It wasn't even concern for me. It was more like vigilance. That night, my husband fell asleep quickly, probably exhausted. I lay with my back to him, my eyes wide open in the darkness, listening to the hum of the air conditioner and the cold, heavy beat of my own heart. If there was something in my suitcase that wasn't mine, what could it be? Cash, jewelry, something valuable, or something that could cause serious trouble. I didn't dare let my imagination run wild, but I understood one thing. If that bag was inspected at the airport tomorrow, the person responsible would be the one whose name was on the luggage tag, and that name was mine. I'm not one to overreact, but I'm also not the kind of daughter-in-law who would quietly take the fall for something I didn't do. I had put up with enough to keep the peace. I could tolerate harsh words, condescending looks, and meals that felt more like examinations than family dinners. But I could not tolerate something that could drag me into a disaster. I suddenly remembered my mother-in-law in the hallway, holding that small, dark bag. If she put it in my suitcase, it meant she had opened it. When had she done that? While I was busy packing in the living room, while my back was turned in the shower, or while I was in the kitchen getting water? And why, as I lay there, did Megan's face suddenly appear in my mind? She was her mother's darling, spoiled since she was a child, and her father adored her too. My husband loved his sister, but within reason. My mother-in-law was different. With Megan, she seemed to melt. She could yell at me, but with Megan, she would only gently remind. As I thought about this, a chill spread through me. I only managed to get a little sleep as dawn approached. At exactly 4 a.m, the whole house woke up as if on a timer. Megan cried out that she couldn't find her makeup bag. My father-in-law was busy checking all the light switches. My husband was running back and forth, and my mother-in-law stood in the middle of it all, a folder in her hand, her voice a constant stream of commands. I finished getting dressed and came out. My mother-in-law handed me a jacket. "It's cold this early. Put this on." "Yes, thank you," I said, taking the jacket. My hand instinctively went into the pocket. Near the inner seam, I felt a small, hard lump tucked deep inside as if to be hidden. If I hadn't touched that exact spot, I would have missed it. I kept my expression neutral. I zipped up the jacket as if I knew nothing. My mother-in-law was standing right there. Her eyes flickered toward me for a split second, then looked away as if nothing had happened. In that instant, I knew. Something was being hidden, not just in the suitcase, but in this jacket too. The morning chill wasn't what made me shiver. It was the coldness inside me. The car took us to the airport. My mother-in-law sat in the back next to Megan, but her eyes kept darting to the front, where I held my gray suitcase at my feet. She watched it like a hawk, as if afraid someone might touch it. My husband leaned his head against the seat and closed his eyes. My father-in-law was muttering last-minute reminders. Megan had her headphones in, smiling at something on her screen, and I sat straight, looking out the window as the streetlights swept across my face. A single thought ran through my mind on a loop. If I stayed silent, I would be the one to take the fall. If I made a scene, I would be accused of being a paranoid daughter-in-law and ruining the trip. But if I did nothing, I could lose my reputation, my entire life. I didn't want revenge. I just wanted to protect myself. An idea sparked in my mind, simple and cold as ice. Swap the suitcases. All it would take was a moment, a distraction. All it would take was to let the person my mother-in-law was so sure would be safe face the consequences of what my mother-in-law herself had set in motion. I took a deep breath and glanced at Megan. She was still oblivious, completely unaware, but I couldn't be sure she was entirely innocent. Some people are raised in calculating families. They don't have to get their hands dirty, they just have to look the other way. The car pulled up to the airport terminal. My mother-in-law clutched her purse tightly. I heard her take a sharp, quick breath before composing herself. I bent down and touched my gray suitcase, as if touching a hidden knife. There was a small scratch on the zipper pull that I knew well. I had been using it for 3 years. This was my bag. But something inside it no longer belonged to me. I looked up, staring straight ahead. I told myself that if today was a trap, I would not be the one walking into it barefoot. And just as the car door opened and a blast of cold air hit my face, I knew I was about to do something that could turn this entire family upside down. I still remember it clearly, that moment standing in the terminal at the airport where people pulled their suitcases along with all the excitement of a trip while my family dragged a weight in its chest. The fluorescent lights were so bright you could see every vein, every bead of sweat on everyone's face. My mother-in-law, Carol, stood frozen. Her eyes darted back and forth between the gray suitcase being held at the security checkpoint and the silver one I was carrying. But in that moment, I didn't allow myself to tremble. I knew if I showed any fear, this whole house of cards would collapse another level. David stood beside me, his hand gripping mine, cold as ice. My father-in-law, Richard, looked at his wife like she was a stranger. And Megan was in a panic, crying, unable to form a coherent sentence, just repeating over and over, "It's not mine, I don't know." When a TSA agent asked her to come with them for further inspection, her face went white. My mother-in-law shrieked and lunged forward as if trying to wrestle fate from their hands, but the more she yelled, the more she revealed a terrible truth. She wasn't afraid of a misunderstanding. She was afraid of being understood correctly. I was called over politely, by the book. They asked me whose silver suitcase it was. I answered calmly that it was my carry-on, and that my checked bag, a black one, had already gone through. I spoke slowly and clearly, not a single extra word. I knew every word I said could either save me or condemn me. My mother-in-law stared at me with a look of both hatred and panic, as if she were desperately searching for a crack to pull me down with her, but she couldn't find one. David looked at me too, and I could read the single word taking root in his eyes: suspicion. We were escorted to a private waiting area, not an interrogation room, but enough to make it clear this was serious. Megan was taken inside first. The door clicked shut, like a period at the end of a sentence. My mother-in-law, Carol, slumped onto a plastic chair, her hands clutching her purse, as if it were the last shred of her dignity. Richard stood by the door, staring down the hallway, his face dark. David pulled me to a corner, his voice low but trembling. "Clara, tell me the truth. What did Mom do with the luggage? Did you see anything?" I looked directly into his eyes. I couldn't tell him what I had done in the pre-dawn rush, nor could I voice my suspicions. I just said the safest, truest thing I could. "I don't know what she put in there, but she's been acting strange since last night." That one sentence was enough for David. I didn't accuse, but I didn't cover for her. He looked at me for a long moment, then turned away like a man turning from a wound he didn't dare touch. Just then, Richard turned back, his voice hoarse, trying to remain calm in front of strangers. "Carol, tell me, what did you put in that suitcase to cause all this?" My mother-in-law looked up, her eyes bloodshot. But it wasn't just from crying, it was the red of pure fear. She shook her head frantically. "Nothing. I don't know. It must have just been there." Richard let out a dry laugh that sounded like wind whistling through an iron gate. "Do you believe that yourself?" At that moment, the door opened. Megan walked out, her legs shaking, her face vacant like someone just pulled from a nightmare. Behind her was an agent, who stated clearly that she was being released for now, but would have to cooperate with the investigation. The luggage was being held, and they needed more time to verify the source of the items inside. I heard every word, each one as heavy as a stone dropping into water. Megan clung to David, sobbing, "David, I'm scared. I didn't do anything." My mother-in-law tried to hug her daughter, but Megan pushed her away, not hard, but with enough force to make a point. It was the first time I had ever seen Megan look at her mother as if she were looking at someone who could harm her, and I understood that in that instant the bond between mother and daughter had been slashed. It wasn't severed, but it was bleeding. Richard led everyone away from the area. A car from a friend of the family was already waiting. The ride from the airport to the hotel should have been filled with laughter and cheerful announcements of our arrival, but no one said a word. My mother-in-law sat huddled in the back seat, staring out the window as if afraid to see her own reflection. David sat next to me, but the space between us felt wider than the entire row. Megan sat in the front, constantly wiping away tears, occasionally looking back at her mother with a mixture of anger and fear. Richard was silent. It was the silence of an old man who has run out of words to scold, left only with a decision he must make. As soon as we entered the hotel lobby, while the staff was still explaining check-in procedures, my mother-in-law's phone rang. She looked at the screen, and all the color drained from her face. She retreated to a corner to take the call. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but her voice was trembling so much that anyone nearby could hear. "No, it must be a mistake. Please don't do anything to her. I'll take care of it." I looked at David. He had heard it too. This time, he didn't ask me any more questions. He just stared at his mother with a look of bitter disappointment. Richard walked over and snatched the phone from her hand. "Who are you talking to?" My mother-in-law tried to grab it back but couldn't. Richard didn't return the phone. He just looked at her as if she had just set fire to their own house. "What have you done, Carol?" Before my mother-in-law could answer, her knees buckled. She collapsed right there on the polished lobby floor. Hotel staff rushed over, calling for help. Megan cried out, "Mom!" But the cry was fractured, laced with fear and anger. David rushed to his mother's side, his hands shaking. Richard stood frozen for a few seconds before finally bending down to help lift her. I stood there, not crying, not panicking. A layer of coldness washed over me. Not because I was heartless, but because I understood. Every time something happened in this family, if I fell apart too, who would keep David standing? Who would keep Megan from shattering completely? I was no longer the daughter-in-law who only knew how to endure. I was in the middle of a vortex, and if I wasn't clear-headed, I would be pulled to the bottom. The hospital here was clean and bright, the smell of antiseptic so sharp it forced a painful kind of clarity. The doctor said my mother-in-law's blood pressure had dropped due to severe stress, and she needed to be monitored. She lay in the bed, an IV in her hand, her eyes closed but her eyelids twitching. Megan sat in a corner, hugging her knees, saying nothing. Richard sat by the bed, his hands clasped together, his face like stone. David stood by the window, looking out. The sky was bright, but I was sure his world felt gray. After a while, my mother-in-law opened her eyes. The first thing she asked wasn't about herself. It was, "Where's Megan? Is she okay?" Megan didn't answer. Carol looked at Richard, then at David. Finally, her gaze landed on me. I met her eyes. I didn't feel any triumph. I just felt sorry for this family, sorry that our holiday gathering had turned into a courtroom the moment we stepped off the plane. David turned from the window, his voice low and strange, as if he were speaking to a mother he no longer recognized. "Mom, I'm asking you this one time, and I want the truth. What did you put in that suitcase? Who are you involved with? Who was that on the phone?" My mother-in-law bit her lip, her eyes darting around. She was about to lie. I could see it. But Richard spoke first, his voice chillingly calm. "Carol, do you want to save your daughter or destroy her? If you keep being evasive, it won't just be Megan. David, Clara, and I, none of us will be able to bear the consequences." My name, mentioned in that hospital room, felt like an exclamation point. I saw David flinch, as if he'd just remembered. That's right, the person who had almost been thrown to the wolves was none other than me. My mother-in-law looked at me, her eyes reddening, but this time it wasn't with defiance, it was with the shame of her own collapse. I didn't say much. I just slowly asked a question, as light as a breath, but heavy enough to choke her. "Mom, if it had been me detained today instead of Megan, would you have spoken a single word for me?" The room fell silent. David stared at me, his expression darkening, then clearing slightly, like someone who had just had a bucket of cold water thrown in his face. Megan lifted her head and looked at her mother, tears streaming down her face, no longer sobbing. Richard let out a long sigh, a sigh that felt like a final seal. My mother-in-law began to tremble uncontrollably. She tried to turn away, but she couldn't escape that question. My mother-in-law, Carol, remained silent for a long time after my question. Her silence wasn't her usual stubbornness, it was the silence of someone cornered at the edge of a cliff, one step away from falling. The IV dripped steadily, each drop echoing in the heavy air of the hospital room. Outside the window, the Miami sky was a hazy gray, no rain but not a trace of sunlight to hold on to. She turned her face away, her lips pressed into a thin line, her trembling hands pulling the blanket higher as if to hide behind the thin fabric. My father-in-law, Richard, watched her for a long moment before standing up. He pulled a chair closer to the bed, his voice no longer sharp but weary. "Carol, you're not young anymore. Whatever you do, you have to think about the consequences. If you don't talk today, they'll make you talk tomorrow. But by then, will you still be able to protect your children?" Hearing this, Megan, who had been huddled in the corner, burst into tears. Her sobs were no longer fierce but choked, like a child who has just realized the adult she trusted most is capable of doing something terribly wrong. She stood up and took a few steps toward the bed, her voice trembling. "Mom, just say it. I can't take this anymore. I don't want to live in fear like this." My mother-in-law turned back to her daughter. Her eyes, at that moment, made her look old for the first time. Not old because of her age, but old from the weight she carried. She raised a hand, intending to take Megan's, but it fell midway, as if she no longer dared to touch her own child. "Megan, I just wanted what was best for you." That sentence made David let out a short, bitter laugh. He was leaning against the wall, his arms crossed, his voice low but sharp. "What kind of best was that, Mom? The kind that almost dragged this entire family down with you?" My mother-in-law flinched, looking at her son. Perhaps she wasn't used to him speaking to her that way. Until now, no matter their disagreements, he had always maintained a respectful distance. Today, that distance had been demolished. I stood still, not interfering. I knew that anything I said now could be seen as adding fuel to the fire. But I also knew the truth was being forced out, whether anyone wanted it or not. My mother-in-law closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and let it out slowly, as if releasing something that had been pressing on her chest for a long time. It was money. She said it softly. "Cash, and a few items someone asked me to bring over." The room seemed to grow thicker. Richard frowned. "Who asked you? Asked you how?" My mother-in-law bit her lip, tears spilling from her eyes. "An old acquaintance who does business here. They asked me to carry it back to the States for them. I thought I was just doing a favor. I didn't expect what?" David cut her off. "You didn't expect to get caught, or you didn't expect to almost make your daughter-in-law the scapegoat." My mother-in-law turned to look at me again. Her gaze shifted away quickly, but not before I caught a flicker of shame, very small, but it was there. I wasn't thinking about you," she said, her voice breaking. "I thought they rarely check women, and even if they did, it would just be a paperwork issue." A chill ran down my spine. Rarely check women, such a careless and cruel assumption. Just a paperwork issue, a trivializing phrase for something that could destroy someone's life. Richard slammed his hand on the side of the bed. It wasn't loud, but it made everyone jump. "Stop being ridiculous. Do you have any idea what you've done? This isn't just about money or valuables. This is about the law." Megan shook her head repeatedly, tears streaming down her face. "Mom, you're insane. Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you tell Dad? Why would you do this?" My mother-in-law broke down, sobbing. It was the sound of a woman who had spent her entire life giving orders and being in control, now completely shattered. "I was scared. I was scared if I told you, you wouldn't let me do it. They promised a good job for Megan over there. I was just thinking about her future." That statement made Megan freeze. She looked up at her mother, her eyes a mixture of pain and anger. "I don't need it. I don't need a job like that. I need a normal mother, not one who is willing to put me on the line." The air in the hospital room was so heavy, I found it hard to breathe. I looked at David. He had his eyes closed, his jaw clenched. I knew he was struggling not to say something that would push his mother over the edge. I took a step forward, my voice low but clear enough for everyone to hear. "Mom, do you know why I switched the suitcases?" My question made everyone turn to look at me. My mother-in-law's eyes widened. "You switched them?" I nodded. "Yes, because the night before, I saw you go into the room. I saw you holding a bag. I wasn't sure, but I was scared. I was scared that if something happened, I would be the one to take the fall." David whipped his head around to look at me. His eyes were filled with shock, then dawning comprehension, and finally, a clear and profound regret. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice hoarse. I looked at him without blame. "If I had told you, what would you have done?" You would have asked your mother, she would have denied it, and I would have still had to carry that suitcase onto the plane." He fell silent. Richard sighed, rubbing his forehead. "So Clara almost took the fall for Megan." I didn't answer. The question itself was painful enough. My mother-in-law stared at me for a long, long time. This time, she didn't look away. She said, her voice trembling, "Clara, my daughter, I'm sorry." The words fell to the floor, light but heavy. I didn't feel triumphant. I just felt tired. An apology couldn't erase the original intent, but it showed that she finally understood what she had done. A doctor came in to check on her, saying she needed rest and shouldn't be agitated. Everyone was asked to leave. Before walking out the door, I heard my mother-in-law's voice, very quiet, call after me, "Clara, I know you don't trust me anymore." I turned back to look at her and said slowly, "I trust that you are David and Megan's mother. As for everything else, I think that will take time." Outside the hospital room, the hallway was long and cold. Megan sat down on a bench, burying her face in her hands and crying. David sat beside her, gently patting her back as if comforting a small child. Richard leaned against the wall, his shoulders seeming to stoop a little more. David looked at me, his eyes completely different from how they had been at the airport, softer, but also heavier. "I owe you an apology," he said. I shook my head. "Not right now." He understood. Some apologies need to be said, but at the right time, or they just become another burden. I knew this wasn't over. The legal issues remained. The old acquaintances my mother-in-law mentioned were still a question mark. And most importantly, the trust in this family had been fractured. Not all fractures are visible, but I could feel this one deep in my bones. A cold thought crossed my mind. If I hadn't switched the suitcases that day, if I had been just a little weaker, the person lying in that hospital bed, or worse, the one being detained, could have been me. And I understood that from this moment on, I could no longer be just the submissive daughter-in-law. I had to be vigilant, because if I fell, no one would protect me but myself. After that day, my family felt like we had survived a storm, but no one was sure we were safe yet. My mother-in-law, Carol, was kept in the hospital for 2 more days for observation. My father-in-law, Richard, stayed with her. David, Megan, and I went back to the hotel, but going back was just a phrase. In reality, none of us felt like we were on vacation. The hotel was spacious, the room was bright, and the glass doors looked out onto a perfectly straight road where cars moved in an orderly fashion, completely disconnected from the small tragedy unfolding within a family far from home. I stood by the window for a long time, watching people walk by, thinking a simple thought. If none of this had happened, right now I would probably be excitedly taking pictures to send to my friends, showing off my first trip to Miami. The thought made my heart sink. David stepped out onto the balcony and stood beside me. An unfamiliar silence stretched between us, not the silence of anger, but the silence of people who have just gone through a major crisis and haven't had time to sort through their thoughts. "Are you tired?" he asked in a low voice. "I'm okay," I replied. He nodded, his hand gripping the railing. I knew he was blaming himself, but some mistakes can't be fixed with a simple, "I'm sorry." A little while later, Megan knocked on my door. Her eyes were swollen and her face was pale, as if she had just had another crying spell. "Clara, are you busy? I want to talk to you for a minute." I opened the door and pulled her inside. She sat on the edge of the bed, wringing her hands, her head bowed. I'm sorry," she said quickly, as if afraid I wouldn't let her finish. "If you hadn't switched the suitcases, I probably wouldn't be standing here right now." I looked at her, not with anger, but with sadness. "It wasn't your fault," she shook her head. "But if you hadn't been careful, I would have been the one in trouble. And you would have been the one implicated. I had no idea Mom would do that. I really didn't know." I believed her. Her panic at the airport, the way she looked at her mother in the hospital, it was all genuine. I placed my hand gently on hers. "I know. You don't have to carry this." Megan burst into tears, this time without holding back. "Clara, I'm so scared. I can't even look at my mother anymore. I feel both sorry for her and angry at her. I don't know how to face her." I held her, and my heart softened. After all, she was just a girl who had grown up sheltered by her mother, never imagining that the person she trusted most could put her in danger. "Just give yourself time. No one expects you to understand right away," I said. That evening, David called Richard. I could faintly hear the familiar, weary sigh of a man trying to hold his family together on the other end of the line. "How is Mom, Dad?" he asked. "Better. But her spirits are still low," Richard replied. "The doctor says she needs quiet. As for the situation at the airport, I've contacted a lawyer here. They said there will be more meetings." Hearing that, David fell silent. I saw his shoulders slump. "Dad, if this gets serious, I think Clara and I should prepare for the worst." Richard didn't answer right away. After a moment, he said, his voice tired but firm, "I understand, but I won't let my daughter-in-law get dragged into this." His words stunned me. In 3 years, it was the first time I had ever heard my father-in-law say something so clearly in my defense. I didn't feel happy, I just felt a sting behind my eyes. 2 days later, my mother-in-law was discharged from the hospital. She looked visibly thinner. Her eyes were no longer sharp, but dull and weary. When the family gathered in the hotel room, the air was as heavy as if a block of stone had been placed in the center of the room. Carol looked at each of us, her gaze finally resting on me. She bowed her head. "Clara, I know it's too late to say anything now, but I want you to know, I haven't been able to sleep. I keep thinking, if you hadn't switched the suitcases that day, I would have sent you to your ruin." I remained silent. I didn't know how to respond appropriately. Forgiveness felt too easy, while blame would only make things worse. Richard broke the tense silence. "What's done is done. The important thing now, Carol, is that you cooperate fully with the lawyer. Don't hide anything else." My mother-in-law nodded repeatedly. "I know. I was wrong." David looked at his mother, his voice low and clear. "Mom, I don't need you to do anything more for me or for Megan. I just need you to stop making decisions for other people." Carol burst into tears, nodding. "Okay, I promise." That night, I lay in bed for a long time, unable to sleep. The question I had asked my mother-in-law in the hospital replayed in my mind. If it had been me, would you have spoken a single word for me? Thinking about it now, I knew the answer. But it didn't seem to matter as much anymore. What mattered was that I had saved myself. I understood that after this, my position in the family had changed. Not because I was clever, but because they had all seen that I was no longer the person who would endure anything just to keep the peace. I had boundaries, and when those boundaries were crossed, I would protect myself. Before falling asleep, David turned and held me. His embrace wasn't clumsy like it sometimes was, but tight, very tight. "Thank you for being so clear-headed," he said. I closed my eyes, feeling a little lighter. I knew the storm wasn't over. The legal battle was still ahead, and the relationship between my mother-in-law and me couldn't heal overnight. But at least I was no longer walking in the dark. The following days passed so slowly, it felt as though I could hear the clock hands scraping against my mind with every passing minute. The family was still in Miami, but no one mentioned the word vacation anymore. All sightseeing plans were canceled. We shuttled between the hotel and the lawyer's office, between tense phone calls and long, suffocating silences. My father-in-law, Richard, shouldered almost everything. He met with the lawyer, provided documents, gave statements, and signed papers. Each time he returned, his back seemed a little more stooped. I saw it all but didn't know how to offer comfort in a way that felt right. Sometimes I'd find him sitting alone on the balcony, staring down at the street, a cigarette burning down in his hand. I knew that for a man who valued family and honor as much as he did, this was a heavy blow. My mother-in-law, Carol, became quiet after being discharged. She no longer gave orders, no longer scowled, and no longer scrutinized me as she used to. She would just sit silently in her room, staring at her phone and sighing. Some nights, I could hear her crying softly through the thin wall. The sound no longer annoyed me, it just made me feel a deep sense of exhaustion and helplessness. David was different. He grew withdrawn, not in an avoidant way, but in a way that suggested he was thinking too much. Sometimes I'd catch him in front of his laptop, reading and rereading pages about legal statutes he didn't fully understand. He was trying to find a way to control something he had never had to face before, the consequences of his mother's decisions. One afternoon, the lawyer called to say Richard needed to meet with the authorities again. When my mother-in-law heard this, her face went pale. She stood up and paced the room, wringing her hands and muttering, "They must suspect more now. I don't know if this will affect the kids." I was standing nearby. Normally, I would have stayed silent. But this time, I felt the need to say something, not to soothe her, but to put things in their proper place. "Mom, let's take this one step at a time. David and I did nothing wrong, so no one has the right to detain us." Carol looked at me, her expression a mixture of anxiety and surprise. Perhaps she wasn't used to me speaking so directly. She gave a very slight nod. "Yes, I know. That evening, when it was just David and me in our room, he finally said what he had been holding in for days. "Clara, I've been thinking a lot," he said, his voice heavy. "If this turns out badly, if Mom faces serious charges, I don't know where I'm supposed to stand." I turned to look at him. It was one of the rare times he had voiced his inner conflict. "You are her son, but you are also my husband," I said slowly. "You can't take responsibility for her actions, but you also can't completely turn your back on her. The important thing is that you don't leave me standing alone." David looked at me for a long time, then nodded. I saw a new resolve in his eyes, no longer hazy as before. The next morning, Richard left with the lawyer. My mother-in-law stayed at the hotel, too weak to go. Megan curled up on a chair, hugging a pillow, staring blankly at the TV without watching it. I sat down next to her. "Do you want to go back home early?" I asked. Megan shook her head. "I'm afraid if I leave, people will think I'm running away." "No one will think that," I said. "But I understand how you feel," she sighed. "Clara, if Mom is never the same after this, will you blame her?" The question made me pause. I couldn't answer with empty platitudes. "I won't blame her, but I won't forget either," I said honestly. "Some things can be forgiven, but trust can never be fully restored." Megan nodded, her eyes welling up. I knew she was growing up very quickly, in a way no one would have wished for. Late that afternoon, Richard returned. He was exhausted, but his expression wasn't as grim as before. The whole family gathered in the living room. "What did the lawyer say, Dad?" David asked. Richard sat down, took a sip of water, and said, "They're going to continue the investigation. But for now, Clara is not implicated in any way. Neither is Megan. The primary responsibility falls on your mother." Hearing that, I let out a quiet sigh of relief, though my heart still felt heavy. My mother-in-law bowed her head, tears falling onto the back of her hand. I've brought misery to this whole family." Richard looked at her, not harshly, but said very slowly, "The person you brought the most misery to is Clara." That sentence was like a dull knife, but it cut deep. My mother-in-law turned to look at me, her lips trembling. "Clara, I don't dare ask for your forgiveness. I just hope that if something happens to me, you won't let David and Megan resent me." I looked at her, feeling a strange sensation. It wasn't pity, nor was it anger. It was like watching someone who had just lost their place in their own family. "I can't make promises for other people," I said, "but I think what you need to do right now is be honest with the law and with your family." Carol nodded, tears streaming down her face. That night, I couldn't sleep. I thought about my 3 years as a daughter-in-law, the tense meals, the words I swallowed, the scrutinizing looks. I realized that if this hadn't happened, I might have continued to endure it all until one day I no longer recognized myself. The next morning, I woke up early and made some tea. My mother-in-law came out, saw me, and hesitated for a moment. "You're up early." "Yes, ma'am," I replied. She sat down across from me, silent for a while, then said very quietly, "Clara, I know I have no right to teach you anything anymore, but I want to say one thing. You are a clear-headed woman. David is lucky to have you." I looked at her. For the first time, she was speaking to me not from the position of a mother-in-law, but like a woman who had just recognized her own mistake. I didn't say anything more. Some words only need to be heard. I knew the road ahead was still long. The legal issues weren't resolved, and this family couldn't heal overnight. But at least I had overcome my greatest fear, the fear of being silently sacrificed. And I also understood that from now on, I would not allow anyone, not even my mother-in-law, to put me in that position ever again. The days that followed felt like living on a pane of cracked glass. It hadn't shattered, but the slightest touch revealed its sharp edges. We still functioned as a family, eating at the same table and making necessary small talk, but no one was carefree enough to laugh. Each of us carried our own private thoughts, our own anxieties, and a silence that others couldn't enter. My father-in-law, Richard, seemed to age visibly after his meetings with the lawyer. He spoke less, but his gaze was sharper, more serious than before. I knew he was weighing many things: the family's reputation, his children's future, and the wife he had lived with for decades. Some evenings, he would sit alone in the living room reviewing documents, his eyes lingering on a certain passage before he would let out a long sigh. My mother-in-law, Carol, lived in a state of tense anticipation. Every unfamiliar phone call made her jump. She no longer blamed anyone or lectured us, but quietly observed everyone. I knew this silence wasn't born of complete remorse but of fear. Fear of the consequences, fear of losing her children, fear of losing her last foothold in the family. One afternoon, while David and Richard were out meeting the lawyer, it was just me, my mother-in-law, and Megan in the hotel. Megan was in her room with the door slightly ajar. My mother-in-law and I sat across from each other at the small dining table. No one spoke. The pot of tea had long gone cold. It was Carol who broke the silence first, her voice hoarse, stripped of its usual sharpness. "Clara, I want to ask you something." I looked at her and nodded. "Yes, go ahead." She looked down, nervously turning a teacup in her hands. If I have to face legal consequences for this, will you be angry with me?" The question caught me off guard. I hadn't expected her to be so direct. I didn't answer right away. I needed to be honest without pushing her into despair. "I won't be angry in a hateful way," I said slowly, "but I will be sad that you didn't consider the consequences for everyone around you." Carol nodded, a tear rolling down her cheek and into the teacup. "I know. I was so foolish. I always thought I was being clever, thought I was providing for my daughter, but I didn't realize I was hurting her. I didn't offer any comfort. I let her speak. Some regrets need to be voiced before a person can truly face them." "Mom," I said after a moment, "I don't expect you to sacrifice or suffer for anyone, but I hope you understand one thing. A daughter-in-law is a person, too. She has a family, a future. She isn't a vessel for others to dump their burdens into." Carol looked at me, her eyes trembling, and she nodded very slowly. "I understand now, though it's too late. I understand." Just then, Megan came out. She had overheard the last part, and her face went pale. She looked at her mother, her voice choked. "Mom, did you really intend to let Clara take the fall for me?" The question landed like a knife. My mother-in-law didn't deny it, she just lowered her head. I was blind at that moment. Megan burst into tears. She turned to me, then back to her mother. "Do you have any idea what would have happened to Clara's life if she hadn't switched the suitcases? Do you realize she's David's wife? That she's part of our family?" Carol trembled violently. I looked at Megan and saw not just anger in her eyes, but a complete shattering of faith. I placed a hand on her shoulder. "Megan, calm down. It's over now." She shook her head. "Clara, I can't just pretend it didn't happen. I'm her daughter, and even I'm terrified. I can't imagine how you must feel." Her words made me choke up. I realized that from this moment on, the relationship between Carol and Megan would never be the same, not out of hatred, but out of disillusionment. That evening, when David returned, his expression was heavy. He led me out to the balcony. "The lawyer said there's a high probability Mom will face a heavy fine, possibly a travel ban, and even a suspended sentence." I was silent. The news wasn't surprising, but it was still heavy. "I've already told Dad," he continued. "He said that no matter what, we have to face it. We can't use money or connections to cover it up." I looked at him and saw in his eyes not just fatigue, but a clear sign of maturity. He was no longer trying to escape. "David," I said, "no matter how this ends, I want you to remember one thing. A family is a place to lean on, not a place to sacrifice the weaker members. He looked at me and nodded. I know. And I'm sorry I made you protect yourself. I didn't say it was okay. I just took his hand. Some apologies don't need a response, they just need to be acknowledged. A few days later, the official decision came through. My mother-in-law had to remain in the country to cooperate further with the investigation. She was not allowed to leave the area. Richard decided to stay with her. David and I would take Megan back to Chicago first. The farewell at the airport was nothing like our arrival. My mother-in-law stood before me, her eyes red. Clara, I don't know if I'll have another chance to speak to you like this. I just want to say, I owe you. I met her gaze without flinching. You owe me a lesson, Mom. I hope you remember it. She nodded, saying no more. Megan hugged her mother, crying for a long time. When it was my turn, Megan whispered, Clara, thank you for not letting me carry something I didn't do. I stroked her hair. Go home and live well. That's the best way to repay anyone. As the plane took off, I looked out the window and saw the figures of Richard and Carol shrinking on the tarmac. I didn't feel relief, nor did I feel heavy. It was just a very clear feeling. Some families have to go through a crisis for each person to find their true place. I turned to David. He was holding my hand tightly. We're going home, he said. I want to start over. Not like before. I nodded. I knew starting over didn't mean forgetting everything. It meant moving forward with clearer boundaries and a respect that was no longer ambiguous. The plane landed at O'Hare on a drizzly afternoon. I pulled my suitcase, my heart lacking the usual excitement of returning home from a trip. This homecoming felt like I was dragging a long shadow behind me, the shadow of unfinished business, of fractures that hadn't healed. David walked beside me in silence. Megan followed, a baseball cap pulled low over her face, her eyes avoiding contact as if she were afraid of being recognized. When we arrived home, the familiar house was the same, but the atmosphere was different. There was no mother-in-law's voice calling from the kitchen, no familiar shuffle of slippers on the floor. Everything was tidy and strangely quiet. I set my suitcase down and took a deep breath. For the first time in 3 years of marriage, I walked into this house without having to brace myself to read someone's mood. Megan went to her room and quietly closed the door. I knew she needed space to breathe. David sank onto the sofa, leaned back, and closed his eyes for a long moment. I made a pot of tea and placed it in front of him. Drink this. He opened his eyes and looked at me, his gaze a mixture of gratitude and exhaustion. Even back here, my head is still spinning. It won't feel light until it's over, I said, my voice calmer than I expected. That evening, there were only 3 of us for dinner. The meal was silent. Megan ate very little, picking at her food. I didn't press her. Sometimes people need time to digest emotions more than food. After dinner, Megan stood out on the balcony. I joined her, keeping a comfortable distance. Clara, she began, do you think when Mom comes back, things will ever go back to the way they were? I looked at the dark, dense sky, the city lights blurred by the rain. I don't think so, I answered honestly. But not everything needs to go back to the way it was. Megan sighed. I used to think family was the safest place in the world. Now I know that safety depends on the people in it. I nodded. She was growing up not by years, but by fractures. In the following days, life slowly returned to a rhythm, but a different one. David left for work earlier and came home later. I focused more on my own work. Neither of us said it, but we both knew that after this, we needed to be stronger, not just for ourselves, but to be a pillar for Megan. One evening, my father-in-law, Richard, called. His voice was tired but clear. David, your mother and I are okay. Things here will still take time. I just wanted to tell you to look after Megan for me at home. Of course, Dad. Don't worry, David replied. I could hear my mother-in-law's voice faintly on the other end, as if she were standing far from the phone. Is Clara there? David handed the phone to me. I held it, silent for a few seconds, then answered, Yes, I'm here. Are you doing okay at home? She asked, her voice trembling. Yes, we're fine. A long silence followed. I didn't initiate any further conversation. She was the one who had to speak if she had something to say. Clara, I know no amount of apologies is enough. I just want you to know I'm paying the price. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. "I understand," I said. "But Mom, paying the price isn't about being forgiven. It's about not making the same mistake again." On the other end, she started to cry. I didn't comfort her or cut her off. Some tears need to be shed completely. After hanging up, I gave the phone back to David. He looked at me, his expression complex. "You can still talk to her," he said. "I talk to her because I don't want to hold a grudge," I replied. "But that doesn't mean everything is as it was." He nodded. "I understand." A week later, Megan asked me to drive her to a friend's house. On the way, she said suddenly, "Clara, I think I'm going to move out for a while." I was a little surprised. "Have you thought this through?" She nodded. "I need to learn to be responsible for my own life, not relying on Mom and not hiding behind you and David." I smiled. It was not an easy decision, but a necessary one. David found out, was silent for a moment, then said, "I support her, but she can always come home." Megan smiled, her first genuine smile in days. In the days that followed, I realized I had changed. I no longer hesitated to voice my thoughts. I no longer automatically stepped back in the face of conflict. Not because I wanted a confrontation, but because I understood the value of self-preservation. One evening, David sat next to me, his voice low. "Clara, I want to ask you something. When Mom eventually comes back, would you be okay with living together?" I had thought about this question many times. "I won't run from it," I said, "but I need boundaries. I can't live like I did before." David was silent, then nodded. "I'll make that clear to them. This time, I stand on the side of what's right." I looked at him and saw no more hesitation in his eyes. Perhaps this crisis hadn't just changed me, it had forced him to grow up too. That night, I lay awake for a long time. I thought about my mother-in-law, the woman who had once treated me like an outsider, who had almost led me to disaster. I didn't hate her, but I was no longer naive. I understood that in family life, kindness alone is not enough. There must be boundaries. I also thought about myself. If I hadn't switched the suitcases that day, if I had remained the submissive daughter-in-law, where would my life be now? The thought made me shudder, and I knew that my clearest decision wasn't switching the suitcases, but choosing not to be silent anymore. The next morning, I woke up early and opened the window, letting the sunlight stream into the house. I made tea, its gentle aroma filling the air. This house had weathered a storm. The cracks were still there. But I believed that if each person was willing to face their own mistakes, this house could still stand, just in a different way. I knew the road ahead still held challenges. My mother-in-law's legal troubles weren't over. The emotional wounds in each person needed time to heal, but at least I was no longer afraid. I had learned how to stand tall in my own home, and I understood that sometimes, to save a family, you have to accept a new way of loving. In the following days, the small house my husband David and I shared gradually settled into a new rhythm, one starkly different from before. The invisible presence of my mother-in-law, which had once made me measure every word and step, was gone. Yet, its absence was palpable, not a void of love, but the vacuum left by a familiar power that had been withdrawn. In the mornings, I would cook, and David would help with the dishes, small chores he rarely did when we lived with his parents. Megan did move out. The day she left, the sun was gentle. Standing at the door, she turned back to me, her eyes red. "Clara, if it hadn't been for you that day, I don't think I would have made it." I hugged her and patted her back. "You're stronger than you think. You just never had the chance to stand on your own." Megan nodded and pulled her suitcase away. Watching her go, I realized this crisis hadn't just broken some relationships. It had forced each of us to grow up in a way no one would have chosen. One evening, David came home later than usual, his face weary. I had dinner ready and was waiting. "Is something wrong?" I asked. He pulled out a chair and sighed. "I saw Uncle Mark today." I paused. Mark was my father-in-law's younger brother, a man who rarely visited but always acted like he knew best. "What did he say?" I asked. He asked about Mom's situation, then said our family would likely face a lot of gossip from relatives. He advised me to be gentle with Mom, not to make a big deal out of it. I said nothing. I knew what gentle meant in the language of relatives. It meant silence, endurance, pretending nothing had happened. David looked at me, as if guessing my thoughts. I didn't answer him right away. I told him some things can't be brushed aside gently. I looked at him, a strange feeling rising in my chest, not quite joy, but reassurance. "You were right to say that," I said. He gave a tired smile. "I know. But I also know things won't be as quiet for us from now on." "It was never quiet before," I replied, half joking. He chuckled, then his expression grew serious again. A few days later, my father-in-law called, his voice low, as if he had been thinking a great deal. "Clara, I want to ask your opinion on something." "Yes, Dad, go ahead." "I'm thinking that once this is all over, your mother and I won't move back in with you. I'm thinking of selling the old house and moving to a smaller place in the countryside, somewhere quieter." I was stunned. I never expected him to make such a decision. I knew that for a man like him, leaving the house he had built his entire life around was not easy. "Dad, have you thought this through carefully?" I asked. He sighed. "I've thought about it a lot. Your mother needs a place to slow down, and you children need your own space." I understood this wasn't just a decision about where to live. It was my father-in-law's way of resetting the boundaries for the entire family. "I respect your decision, Dad," I said, "and thank you for thinking of us." On the other end, he was silent for a moment. "Clara, I owe you an apology. Before I saw how your mother treated you, and I said nothing. I thought it was between women, that you would sort it out. Now I know I was wrong." A lump formed in my throat. "Dad, please don't say that. You protected me when it mattered most." "It's what I should have done from the beginning," he said. After we hung up, I sat in silence for a long time. I never imagined that the first person in my husband's family to truly acknowledge my place would be my father-in-law, after everything that had happened. One afternoon, my mother-in-law, Carol, called me. It was the first time she had called me directly since I returned. I stared at the screen for a long moment before answering. "Yes, I'm listening." "Clara, I'm sorry to bother you." Her voice was weak. "Yes, Mom, what is it? I heard from your father that he's planning to move. I know it's because of me." I didn't confirm or deny it. "Mom, that's Dad's decision." She was quiet for a moment, then said, "I don't blame him. I just feel like a failure. My whole life, I tried to provide for my family, and in the end, I just pushed everyone away." For the first time, I heard no defensiveness in her voice. "Mom," I said slowly, "there's nothing wrong with wanting to provide for your family, but when you do it without asking what others want, it becomes control." She started to cry, small, broken sobs. "I know, but I was scared. Scared that no one would need me anymore." Her words made my heart ache. Behind all the control and calculation was the fear of being left behind by an aging woman. "You are still David's mother, and you will be a grandmother to his children one day," I said, "but every role needs to be in its right place." She stopped crying and sighed. "Clara, if I come back, I won't ask for anything. I just hope you'll give me a chance to start over." I didn't answer right away. I knew such a promise would be easy to make, but hard to keep. "Mom, a chance isn't something I can give you. It's something you create for yourself," I said, "by respecting our boundaries." She nodded, though I couldn't see her. "Yes, I'll remember." After hanging up, I felt a little lighter, not because everything was fixed, but because I no longer had to tense up to deal with her. That night, I told David what had happened. He was quiet, then said, "I think everyone is paying the price for their actions. Maybe that's the only way things can change." I nodded, just hoping this change was real. A month later, news came from Miami. My mother-in-law's case had been resolved. She received a heavy fine and a multi-year travel ban. No jail time, but she would be under supervision. Richard went ahead with selling the house. When David read the news, he sat still for a long time. "I'm sad," he said, "but I also feel a sense of relief." I understood. Some losses are necessary to stop a family from continuing to live in a broken structure. The day his parents returned, I went to the airport with David. My mother-in-law emerged, much thinner than before. She looked at me, her gaze completely different, no scrutiny, no defensiveness, just a quiet reservation. "Clara," she said. "Yes, Mom. Thank you for still coming to meet us today." I nodded. I came not because I had forgotten, but because I chose to face it. On the drive, no one said much. But I knew that from this moment on, this family had entered a new chapter, no longer perfect, but more real. That night, I stood on the balcony, looking down at the familiar street. I thought about the journey I had taken, from a submissive daughter-in-law to a woman who knew her boundaries. I hadn't become cold. I had just become clear. And I understood that sometimes, to keep your own heart intact, you first have to break someone else's. The day my father-in-law, Richard, and my mother-in-law, Carol, officially moved to the countryside, I didn't go with them. It wasn't because I was avoiding them, but because I understood that some family moments need to be contained within the circle of those who created them. I saw them off at the gate, standing beside David, keeping a comfortable distance. Carol turned to look at me for a long time. Her eyes were no longer sharp or scrutinizing, but seemed to be memorizing a final image before leaving. "Clara," she called out softly. "Yes, ma'am," I replied. "Take care of yourself at home," she said, then hesitated. "And look after David for me." I just nodded. No promises, no words of comfort. The car pulled away, kicking up a little dust. I watched until it was out of sight. I felt neither empty nor heavy, just a clear sense that a chapter had closed. In the days that followed, life for David and me settled into a stable routine. Not a comfortable peace, but a conscious one. We talked more, not just about work or daily chores, but about things we used to avoid. David told me about his childhood, about the times his mother made decisions for the whole family, about how he had grown used to his role of being silent. I listened without judgment. I understood that some habits are formed very early, and they can't be changed overnight. One evening, as we were cleaning the kitchen, David said suddenly, "Clara, I think I've gotten too used to letting the women in the family carry too much weight." I stopped what I was doing and looked at him. "What do you mean?" "It used to be Mom. And this time, it was almost you," he said slowly. "I realize I've been avoiding my responsibility to stand in the middle." His words made me pause, not out of blame, but because he was finally looking at his own weakness. "It's good that you realize it," I said, "but what matters is what you do from now on." He nodded, his gaze more determined. "I will not let you stand alone again." It was a simple promise, but one I believed. Meanwhile, Megan's independent life began to stabilize. She rented a small apartment near her job and started managing everything on her own. Sometimes she would come over for dinner. She talked more, laughed more, but was also more mature. I saw a clear change in her, no longer dependent, no longer avoidant. Once, when it was just the two of us, she said, "Clara, I think if that incident hadn't happened, I might have stayed a sheltered girl forever, never knowing what I was capable of." I smiled. No one wants to grow up through pain, but sometimes it's the fastest way. She nodded, her eyes shining with determination. In the countryside, my father-in-law called regularly. He told me about the new house, the garden, about waking up earlier and going to bed sooner. He rarely mentioned my mother-in-law, but I could hear a mix of weariness and relief in his voice. "Your mother has been very quiet lately," he said during one call. "She doesn't talk much, but she listens more." I was quiet, then asked gently, "Dad, are you okay?" He chuckled, a sound that couldn't hide his fatigue. "I'm okay. I just regret not speaking up sooner." Those words stayed with me long after we hung up. I understood that in a family, sometimes the biggest mistake isn't doing the wrong thing, but being silent about the wrong thing for too long. One weekend afternoon, I received a call from my mother-in-law. I looked at the screen, hesitated for a second, then answered, "Clara." Her voice was weak but clear. "Yes, I'm here. Mom, I want to ask you something. If you don't want to answer, I'll understand." "Yes, go ahead." "I want to know if you're still angry with me." The question was no longer a test, but a genuine inquiry. I took a deep breath. "I'm not angry in a vengeful way," I said, "but I still remember, and I need time." She was silent, then said very softly, "I can accept that, as long as you don't hate me." I didn't say I didn't hate her. I just said, "Take care of yourself, Mom." After hanging up, I felt calm. Not because I had completely forgiven her, but because the question no longer rattled me. Another evening, David asked me, If Mom comes to visit someday, would you be ready? I thought about it for a long time. I won't refuse, I said. But things need to be clear. No living together, no interfering in our lives. He nodded. I'll tell her beforehand. I knew this was a huge step for him. Time passed, and the gossip from relatives began to surface. Some pitied us, some blamed us, some were just curious. Some hinted that I was clever at protecting myself, while others said I was cold. I heard it all but didn't react. I understood that outsiders never know the full story, and I didn't need to prove anything. Once, Uncle Mark visited. He looked at me, his tone probing. With all that's happened in the family, you should be a little softer with your mother-in-law. After all, she's getting old. I smiled and replied politely, Yes, Uncle. I am soft in my manners, but I am firm in my boundaries. Uncle Mark was taken aback and said no more. David stood beside me, not intervening, but I knew he was on my side. That night, I lay awake thinking. I thought about the person I was 3 years ago, always afraid of offending others. I thought about the gray suitcase, about the moment I decided to switch it. If I hadn't done that, everything would be different, and perhaps I would be different too. I wasn't proud of escaping disaster. I just saw one thing clearly. A woman cannot live on blind sacrifice alone. Sacrifice without limits sooner or later becomes self-destruction. The next morning, I made tea and opened the window. Sunlight streamed into the kitchen. I heard birds chirping, the distant sound of traffic. Life went on, not waiting for anyone to finish healing. I turned to look at David reading the paper. I saw a slow but steady change in him. I saw a new resilience in myself, and I knew this journey wasn't over. The cracks in our family needed more time to mend. Trust had to be rebuilt, not with words, but with repeated actions. But at least I was no longer afraid. I had learned to stand in my own place, no lower and no higher than anyone else. After that family memorial, I thought things had settled down. Our family had entered a new phase, no longer loud and confrontational, but no longer carefree either. I got used to living more deliberately, always conscious of my boundaries, not just with my mother-in-law but with relatives and even my own husband. But life rarely lets you stay comfortable for long. One early weekday afternoon at work, I got a call from Megan. Her voice was rushed, completely unlike her usual self. "Clara, are you free? I need to talk to you." My heart sank. "Go ahead, what is it?" "I'm at my apartment." Mom called me. She said she wants to sell a piece of land back home." I froze. "Which piece of land?" "The one our grandparents left, where Dad has his garden." Her voice trembled. "Mom said she needs the money for some things." I was silent for a few seconds, my mind flashing back to the image of my mother-in-law, Carol, with her tired eyes and thin frame, and her past words. "I'm scared. No one will need me anymore." I knew this wasn't just about money. "What did you say to her?" I asked. I told her I had to ask David first. Mom got quiet, but she sounded so sad, Clara. I hung up and sat still for a long time. This was bound to happen sooner or later, and I knew if we didn't handle it carefully, this family would be pulled into another vortex. That night, I told David. He frowned as he listened. "I knew she wouldn't sit still," he said, "but selling the land isn't simple. That's where Dad is living." "What do you think she wants the money for?" I asked. He sighed. "It could be money, or it could be the feeling of being in control again." That thought struck me. He was right. For my mother-in-law, losing control was the hardest thing to bear. She was used to deciding everything. Now that she wasn't at the center of the family, she could easily feel marginalized. "What are you going to say to her?" I asked. David was quiet for a long time. "I'm going to go talk to them in person, and I want you to come with me." I looked at him. This time, I didn't feel scared or avoidant. I just considered it. "I'll go, but you have to be clear with her first." "I'm not going there to back down or take responsibility for anyone." He nodded. "I know." We drove out to the countryside that weekend. The old house, nestled in its garden, was quieter than I remembered. My father-in-law, Richard, was watering plants. He was happy to see us, but his eyes held a hint of worry. "Why didn't you tell us you were coming?" David said. "I wanted to talk to you, Dad. My mother-in-law came out from the house. She was wearing a simple dark blouse, her hair in a neat bun, looking thinner than before. She paused when she saw me, then gave a slight nod. "Clara." "Yes, Mom, hello." The atmosphere was a bit stiff but not tense. We sat down at a wooden table on the porch. Richard poured tea. "Your mother told Megan about selling the land," he said directly. "She wanted to hear what you two think." My mother-in-law looked down, her voice small. "I won't hide it. I thought it would be best to sell some of it now, so I won't be a burden on you children later." The phrase, "not be a burden," felt like a dagger, laced with pride and hurt. "Mom," David began, his voice low, "Dad is living on this land. You can't just sell it without discussing it first." Carol looked up, her eyes red. "I just thought, your father is getting older. He could live anywhere." Richard set his teacup down, his voice calm but firm. "Carol, this is my home. This is where I choose to live. You don't get to make that decision." The mood turned heavy. My mother-in-law looked from her husband to me, her expression no longer sharp but full of hurt. "Clara, what do you think?" she asked. The question silenced the table. I knew my answer was critical. I couldn't stay out of it, but I couldn't speak on impulse either. "Mom," I said slowly, "I don't disagree with you wanting to plan for the future, but the way you're doing it will hurt people, especially Dad." She bit her lip. "I'm just afraid no one will be there for me later." I looked directly at her. "It's right to worry about your future, but that future can't be built on someone else's insecurity." Richard sighed. "Do you see, Carol? No one is abandoning you, but you have to stop thinking everything is your right." My mother-in-law burst into tears, not loudly, but with choked sobs. "I'm so tired. I'm used to being the pillar, making the decisions. Now I have to ask about everything. I feel useless." Hearing that, I finally understood. Behind all her mistakes was a deep-seated fear of being pushed to the side. "You're not useless," I said, "but you can't control everything either. Letting go isn't the same as losing." She looked at me, tears streaming down her face. "Clara, if I hadn't done that foolish thing that day, you probably wouldn't look at me the way you do now." I paused for a second, then answered truthfully, "Maybe, but it's also possible that if that hadn't happened, you would have never stopped to look at yourself." My words made her freeze. In the end, the idea of selling the land was dropped. Richard stood by his decision to stay. My mother-in-law said no more, but she seemed completely drained. As we were leaving, she called me into the kitchen. "Clara," she said, her voice trembling, "I know you don't trust me like you used to, but I want you to know I'm learning how to stop." I looked at her without anger or pity. "Take your time, Mom. No one expects you to change overnight." She nodded, tears falling. On the drive back, David was quiet for a long time. "I think she's weaker than I realized," he said. "Because she no longer has power," I replied. "When people lose their power, their greatest fears are exposed." He took my hand. "Thank you for not staying out of it." I looked out the window as the fields rolled by. I knew this family wasn't stable yet. My mother-in-law still had to learn a new way of living. My father-in-law still had to face his old age. Megan still had to find her own footing, and I had to continue holding my boundaries. But at least this time, I was no longer a passive bystander. After that trip to the countryside, I felt a subtle but profound shift in the family. It wasn't a loud, dramatic change, but a quiet transformation, like soil after a rainstorm, softer, but still full of old roots. My mother-in-law, Carol, no longer called as frequently. Her calls became shorter, mostly asking about my father-in-law's health, and then a gentle inquiry about us. "Are you two doing okay?" I would answer just enough. Not cold, but not overly warm either. I knew that if I opened up too quickly, things could easily slip back into the old dynamic. And if I stayed too closed off, the family would be nothing but walls. My father-in-law, Richard, seemed more at ease after the talk about the land was settled. He called David more often, not to complain, but to share small, everyday things. "The grapefruit tree is blooming. The new hen laid an egg. There was dew this morning." These seemingly trivial stories were, to me, signs that he was slowly accepting a different, less burdened life. One evening, while David and I were having dinner, He put down his chopsticks and said slowly, "Clara, I think we should visit my parents more often. Not out of obligation, but because I'm afraid Dad is getting older and I'm not noticing." I looked at him, not surprised. "I'm not against it," I said, "but I want things to be clear. We're visiting, not going back to solve their problems." He nodded. "I understand, and I'll make that clear to Mom." I believed him, not because he promised, but because I could see he had truly changed his perspective. He no longer saw standing between two sides as a betrayal to one, but as the responsibility of a grown man. Meanwhile, Megan called me more and more. She told me about work, about money, about nights she came home exhausted but didn't dare call her mother for fear of worrying her. She said, "Clara, I'm starting to understand how you must have felt. It's easy when you're at home. But once you're out on your own, you realize how vulnerable you are." I listened and smiled. "But you're standing on your own 2 feet," I said. "That's what matters." Late one month, my mother-in-law called me unexpectedly. Her voice was different, not trembling or overly reserved. "Clara, I'm coming to the city this weekend. I'd like to see you." I was quiet for a few seconds, my mind flashing through old scenarios, but I pushed them away. "Okay," I said. "Just let us know when, and David and I will make time." She let out a breath of relief. "I won't stay long. I just want to have one meal with you two," I told David after she hung up. He looked at me, waiting for my reaction. "How do you feel about it?" he asked. "I'm not refusing," I said, "but I won't be tense. If anything crosses a boundary, I'll say so." He nodded and took my hand. "I'm here." The day my mother-in-law came, the weather was mild. She arrived alone, carrying a small gift bag. When she walked in, I noticed a change immediately. She was dressed more simply, her movements were slower, and her eyes were no longer scrutinizing. "Clara," she said softly. "Yes, Mom, come in," I replied. The meal was quiet, just the 3 of us. She ate slowly, didn't try to serve me food as she used to, and didn't comment on the dishes. After we finished, she sat on the sofa, her hands folded in her lap, as if she had been rehearsing something for a long time. "Clara," she began, "I want to say something. If you don't want to hear it, just tell me." I sat across from her, looking directly at her. "Go ahead, Mom." "I've been thinking a lot," she said, her voice low. "Before, I always thought everything I did was for the family, but I didn't realize I was using the family to cover up my own fears." I listened quietly, letting her speak. "I was afraid of getting old, afraid of being forgotten, afraid of not being needed." She gave a sad smile. So I held on tighter, and the tighter I held, the more I hurt everyone. David sat beside her, silent, but I saw his hand clench slightly. "Clara, I'm not asking you to forget. I'm just asking if you'll let me stand in my proper place." Her words made my heart soften, not out of pity, but because I realized she had finally reached the root of the problem. "Do you know what the proper place is?" I asked. She nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "To be David's mother, and a grandmother to your children someday, not the person who decides things for you." I let out a very soft breath. "If you can hold to that, then I have no reason to avoid you." She nodded again and again, as if afraid I would change my mind. "I'll remember." That afternoon, as she was leaving, she stood at the door and turned back to me. "Clara, thank you for not pushing me away." I answered honestly, "I didn't push you away, I just held my ground." She understood. I watched her figure disappear down the street, my heart neither light nor heavy, just a fragile sense of peace, like standing on a frozen lake just after the ice has melted. That night, David said to me, "I think Mom is really different." "Because she has nowhere left to hide," I said. "Only when people are forced to give up power do they have to face themselves." He nodded. "Thank you for letting me learn this lesson." I smiled. Not everyone is brave enough to learn it. In the days that followed, I lived more slowly. I was no longer haunted by the question of whether I had been too harsh. I understood that protecting yourself isn't selfish. It's a prerequisite for earning others' respect. I also understood that the mother-in-law, daughter-in-law relationship couldn't be fixed with a few conversations, but at least now it was no longer based on fear or control. One evening, sitting alone on the balcony, I remembered the moment at the airport. The switched suitcase, my mother-in-law's panicked cries. I shuddered. If not for that day, I might still be living a different life, one where I was always the one who lost out. I didn't resent the past. I knew it had pushed me to where I am today. A woman who knows where she stands and will not allow anyone to push her again. After my mother-in-law's visit, the house settled back into its familiar rhythm. There were no immediate, dramatic events, but I knew this was the most dangerous phase, the one where complacency sets in. When the waves have calmed, people tend to think the sea will stay quiet forever. But I was not the woman I had been years ago, the one who would retreat at the mere mention of family peace. David had become more thoughtful, less talkative, but not in an avoidant way. I often caught him in moments of deep thought, sometimes looking at me for a long time as if weighing words he wasn't ready to say. I didn't press him. I had learned that silence can sometimes be more productive than talk. Some thoughts need to be confronted alone first. One evening, as we were clearing out a closet, David pulled out an old binder filled with property deeds and documents. "I'm organizing these," he said. "I want to clearly separate what's yours, what's mine, and what's ours. Not because I don't trust you, but because I don't want anything to be ambiguous later on." I looked at him, a little surprised. "When did you start thinking about this?" "Since the airport," he replied. "Since I realized that one person's blind decision could throw your entire life off course." I nodded. I knew that feeling. Only when you face the edge of losing everything do you truly wake up. "I have no objection," I said. "Being clear from the start makes things easier." He let out a breath, as if a weight had been lifted. "I was afraid you'd think I was being calculating." I gave a small smile. Calculating to protect each other is different from calculating to win. He looked at me, and his eyes warmed. In the following days, we worked on this together calmly, without argument or tension. I realized that a healthy relationship isn't one without sensitive topics, but one that can discuss them while both people are still calm. Meanwhile, Megan visited more often. She told me her job was becoming stable, and while she wasn't saving much, she was making ends meet. "One day," she said, her voice a mix of sadness and resolve, "Clara, Mom called me. She asked if I needed money." "What did you say?" I asked. I told her no. I told her I could manage on my own. She smiled faintly. It was the first time I said that without feeling guilty. I saw something new in her eyes, self-respect. "How did your mom react?" I asked. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Okay, that's good." Megan sighed. She sounded so sad. I didn't say anything more. I knew that for my mother-in-law, every severed cord of dependency was another confrontation with her own emptiness. But that was a journey she had to take alone. One day, my father-in-law called, his voice a little tired. "Clara, I want to ask you something." "Yes, Dad, go ahead. Your mother and I are thinking of renovating the house next year, but she keeps hesitating. I think she's afraid of doing anything wrong." I paused for a second. "Dad, maybe what she needs is to be asked for her opinion, not to be given the power to decide." Richard chuckled softly. "You're right. I'm so used to letting her decide everything, it's not easy to switch roles. Just take it slow," I said. "No one gets used to a new way of life overnight." He sighed, but his voice was lighter. "Clara, I'm truly glad David has you." I felt a lump in my throat. One weekend afternoon, my mother-in-law called again. This time, her voice was hesitant. "Clara, the end of the month is David's birthday. I'd like to come for a meal, but if it's not convenient, I won't." Her way of asking was completely different, not an announcement, but a request. I looked out the window, thinking carefully. "Okay, Mom, let us know when you'll arrive so we can plan," I said. "Just a simple family dinner." On the other end, she let out a sigh of relief. "Thank you, Clara." After hanging up, I sat quietly. I didn't know if this decision was right or wrong, but I knew one thing. If I kept avoiding her, this relationship would exist only in name. But if I opened the door, I had to keep my hand on the knob. On David's birthday, my mother-in-law came with my father-in-law. She brought a small box. When she handed it to me, she whispered, "I didn't know what you'd like. This is a scarf I knitted myself." I took it. The stitches were uneven, the color simple. I knew that in every one of those stitches was a great deal of time and thought. "Thank you, Mom," I said. The dinner was peaceful. No one brought up the past, and no one was overly stiff. My mother-in-law didn't lecture or interfere. My father-in-law talked with David about his garden. Megan told stories about her job. I watched carefully, not to be on guard, but to confirm that the boundaries were still there. After dinner, as they were leaving, my mother-in-law lingered for a moment. "Clara," she said, "I know that just because I'm trying doesn't mean everything will be okay right away, but I'm not going back to the way I was." I looked at her and replied slowly, "I don't need you to be perfect, Mom. I just need you to stop at the right time." She nodded, her eyes glistening. That night, when it was just the two of us, David said to me, "I think she's learning how to step back. Stepping back in the right place isn't losing." I replied. He took my hand. "I know that if you hadn't been so clear-headed that day, this family might have gone in a very different direction." I said nothing. I thought about the suitcase, the airport, the moment I chose not to be silent. I understood that some turning points in life are quiet, but their consequences are long-lasting. I also understood the journey ahead wasn't over. My mother-in-law still had fears she hadn't named. This family still needed time to learn a new way of living. But at least now, I was no longer an outsider in my own life. And if there was one thing I was sure of, it was that true peace only comes when you dare to face the truth instead of covering it up with the word family. After David's birthday dinner, I thought we had reached a fragile but acceptable equilibrium. There were no more major shocks, no more decisions that kept me up at night. The family seemed to be learning to move more slowly, more cautiously, more reserved with its own emotions. But I knew this was the hardest stage. When people start to maintain rather than change, one small slip can send everything back to the beginning. My mother-in-law, Carol, didn't visit the city again right away. She called more regularly, but each call was brief, mostly asking about our health, whether David was working too hard, or if I was busy. There were no more probing questions, no more roundabout lectures. I answered just enough, not avoidant, but not overly familiar either. By maintaining that distance, I felt more at peace. My father-in-law, Richard, was different. He called me privately a few times, not about big issues, but about small things. He asked what kind of plants were easy to grow, whether he should paint the porch a light or dark color, what gift to get David for Christmas. I understood he was trying to make up for his years of silence in the slow, kindest way he knew. One evening, as David and I were sorting through old boxes, he pulled out a photo album filled with family pictures from his childhood. I flipped through the pages and saw a different mother-in-law, younger, smiling more, her eyes not yet heavy with the weight she now carried. "She was different back then," David said, his voice low. "She wasn't like she is now." "No one becomes like that overnight," I replied. "It's just fears that have piled up for too long." He nodded. I knew he was beginning to see his mother not just as a son, but as a grown man. As the end of the year approached, the holiday atmosphere reminded me of exactly 1 year prior, the same time our family was preparing for that trip, the same time the suitcase was switched. I shuddered. It felt like it had just happened. If not for that decision, I didn't know where I would be in my life. One afternoon, Megan stopped by with a few bags. She was smiling, but it seemed a bit tired. "Clara, I think I'm going to spend the holidays with Mom and Dad this year." I was a little surprised. "Have you thought it through?" She nodded. "I have. It's not about going back to how things were. I just want to see if I can face her with a different mindset." I looked at her for a long time. She was no longer the carefree sister-in-law I once knew. She had learned to weigh her options, to question herself. "If you feel it's not right, you can always come back," I said. She smiled. "I know. Thanks to you, I know I have a way out." Her words made a lump form in my throat. I never expected my own clarity to become a source of support for someone else. That night, David told me, "Mom and Dad want us to come for the holidays for a few days." I didn't answer right away. My mind raced with images and scenarios. "Do you want to go?" I asked him. "I do," he said plainly, "but only if you feel safe." I looked at him. This time, I didn't feel like I was being put in a difficult position. "Just for a few days," I said. And we have to agree on something first. If anything happens that makes me uncomfortable, we leave immediately." He nodded without hesitation. Agreed. We arrived 3 days before Christmas. The countryside was quiet, a world away from the city. My mother-in-law greeted us at the door. She seemed a little awkward but tried to remain calm. "You're here," she said. "Yes, ma'am," I replied politely. The first dinner was peaceful. Carol had cooked a lot, but she didn't put food on my plate or urge me to eat this or that. She just asked, "Clara, is the food okay?" "Yes, it's good," I answered. That night, lying in bed, I listened to the wind rustling the bamboo outside. I didn't feel as tense as I'd expected, but I wasn't relaxed either. I maintained a necessary vigilance. The next day, some relatives came by early. Uncle Mark was there. He looked at me with a probing gaze but didn't say much. When someone vaguely alluded to what had happened, my mother-in-law unexpectedly spoke up. "That's in the past. We don't talk about it in this house." The table fell silent. I looked at her. For the first time, she wasn't avoiding or blaming. That evening, when it was just the two of us in the kitchen, Carol was washing dishes and said very quietly, "Clara, I know you're still wary of me." I didn't deny it. "Yes, ma'am. I don't blame you," she said. "If it were me, I'd be the same." I was surprised but said nothing. "I just want you to know I'm trying to live differently. Not so you'll forgive me, but so I can still respect myself." Her words made my heart soften, not out of emotion, but because I realized that for the first time she was talking about herself, not hiding behind the idea of family. "Just do what you feel is right," I said. "You don't have to rush." She nodded, saying no more. On Christmas Eve, the family gathered on the porch. Fireworks exploded in the distance. I stood next to David, his hand in mine. My mother-in-law stood a few feet away, not crowding us, not pulling David closer to her like she used to. I looked at the scene, a strange feeling washing over me. It wasn't complete happiness, but a conscious peace. Everyone knew where they stood. I understood that this family wasn't healed, but it had stopped unconsciously hurting each other. On Christmas morning, I woke up before everyone else. The country air was crisp, a thin layer of frost still clinging to the trees. I put on a coat and stepped out onto the porch, standing for a long time, watching the damp yard. The distant crow of a rooster, the sound of the wind. It was so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. For the first time in years, I woke up in my in-laws' house without a heavy heart. My mother-in-law, Carol, woke up a little after me. She came out, saw me on the porch, paused for a moment, then nodded a greeting. "You're up early." "Yes, ma'am. I'm used to it," I replied. She stood beside me, keeping a comfortable distance, not intruding or scrutinizing. We stood there together in a silence that wasn't uncomfortable. "Have you been sleeping well these past few days?" she asked slowly. "Yes, pretty well." She nodded, looking out at the yard. "That's good." That was all. But I understood that for her, even asking that was a huge effort. Christmas breakfast was simple. My father-in-law, Richard, wished each of us a happy holiday. When he got to me, he said, "For the new year, all I wish for is peace for you children." I bowed my head. "Yes, Dad, thank you." David stood beside me, his hand resting lightly on my back. A small touch, but it was enough to know he was there, solid. After breakfast, Megan got ready to head back to the city. She hugged her mother for a long time. I saw my mother-in-law pat her back, not clinging, not giving too many instructions. "Just call if you need anything," she said. "I will," Megan replied, then turned to me. "Clara, I'm leaving." "Okay, drive safe," I said. As her car disappeared, I saw my mother-in-law stand at the gate for a long time before turning to go back inside, without tears. Perhaps she, too, was learning to accept the space between them. That afternoon, David and I went to visit his grandparents' graves. On the familiar country road, he slowed his pace to walk beside me. "Clara," he said, "I know not everyone could do what you've done." "What do you mean?" I asked. "To stay calm when put in danger," he said, "and to not become bitter afterward." I smiled faintly. "I'm not that noble. I was just afraid that if I wasn't clear-headed, my life would be dictated by someone else." He nodded. I knew this was a lesson he had learned as well. The holidays passed peacefully, without incident or conflict. But I knew this peace wasn't due to luck, it was because each person was holding themselves in a different place. The day before we were set to return to the city, my mother-in-law called me into her room. "Clara," she said quietly, "I won't see you off at the gate. I'm afraid it will put pressure on you." I looked at her, and a lump unexpectedly formed in my throat. "You don't have to do that, Mom." She shook her head. "I need to," she said. "Because before, I always did things that made others uncomfortable." She took a small cloth pouch from a drawer. "I don't have much, just some savings. I'm giving this to you two. Consider it me learning how to give in the right way." I didn't take it right away. "Mom, we don't need it." "I know," she said. "But this isn't about the money. It's about me trying to make amends." I glanced at David. He gave a very slight nod. I took the pouch without opening it. "Thank you, Mom." She let out a breath, as if a great weight had been lifted. The car pulled away from the house. Through the window, I saw my mother-in-law standing on the porch, not waving, just watching. The image didn't make me sad. It made me understand. Some relationships don't need to be held tightly. They just need to stop hurting each other. Back in the city, life went on. Work, chores, quiet evenings. My mother-in-law called less often, but each call was gentle. My father-in-law sometimes sent pictures of his garden. Megan settled into her own life. David and I learned to live as a true family with love, boundaries, and responsibility. One evening, while I was cleaning out a closet, I found the old gray suitcase. I stood looking at it for a long time. So many things had started with that suitcase. So many turns in my life were tied to the decision to switch it. David saw me standing there and asked, "What are you thinking about?" I smiled. "I'm thinking that if I hadn't done that, I would probably be a different person today." "What kind of person?" he asked. "Someone who lived for harmony, but lost herself in the process," I replied. He came and stood beside me, his voice low. "I'm lucky you were so clear-headed that day." I closed the suitcase. I didn't need to keep it as a memento. I just needed to keep the lesson. A year later, our family had a small dinner. No special occasion. My mother-in-law came to visit. She was no longer the woman who made me brace myself. She spoke slowly, asked just enough. When she wasn't sure about something, she asked for an opinion. When I said no, she stopped. Sometimes I would catch her looking at me for a long time. Her gaze was no longer wary or controlling, just something very human, a mix of regret and gratitude. When she left, she said something very quietly to me. "Clara, I know some wounds never disappear, but thank you for not letting this family break apart." I replied slowly, "This family didn't break because everyone was willing to stop at the right time." She nodded. That night, lying next to David, listening to the distant sound of traffic, I thought about the path I had walked, from a submissive daughter-in-law to a woman who dared to protect herself. I hadn't become hard. I had just become clear. I realized the greatest lesson I learned wasn't cleverness, but courage. The courage to not be silent when pushed into danger. The courage to say no to things hidden behind the word family. And the courage to not become a bitter person after surviving it all. My family is not perfect. My mother-in-law did not become a different person overnight. But we learned something important. Love does not mean blind sacrifice, and preserving a family does not mean accepting harm. If anyone were to ask me what I learned from all this, I would say that a clear-headed woman is not a cold woman. She is a woman who knows how to protect herself so that she still has the strength to love the right way. And if I could go back to that moment at the airport a year ago, standing between two identical suitcases, I would still choose to switch them. Not because I was suspicious, but because I had learned to never again place my life in someone else's hands.